Hello, and welcome to a new episode of Oxford Policy Podcast. My name is Cecilia Esteche, and I'm here with Diego Peñaranda. And today we are delighted to welcome Professor James Robinson. But firstly, I would like to say how grateful I am to have the opportunity to speak with one of the world's leading scholars on political economy, institutions, and development. We will explore some of the most important questions in public policy: why some countries prosper, why others struggle, what role institutions play in shaping development in Latin America.
James Robinson is a professor at the Harris School of Public Policy in the University of Chicago. He is co-author of books like Why Nations Fail and The Narrow Corridor, and was awarded the 2024 Nobel Memorial Prize in Economic Sciences alongside Daron Acemoglu and Simon Johnson. Professor Robinson, thank you very much for joining us, and welcome to the Oxford Policy Pod.
My pleasure.
Thank you very much. So we would like to start at the beginning. Before you became an economist, before Yale, before Chicago, was there a particular experience, person, or question that sparked your curiosity about why some societies prosper while others struggle?
Well, that's a complicated question. I think that, my father spent his whole life working overseas in Africa. He was an engineer. We grew up in the Caribbean. I grew up in Barbados and Trinidad, and then we moved back to England. And so I sort of knew that that the world was a kind of complicated place, and that there was something, special and privileged about growing up in British society in the 1970s. And I think when I look back at it, there were a few moments for me, like when I went to study economics at the London School of Economics. The first book that I read, that we had to read, was Max Weber's Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, which of course, and of course that's a book about the impact of the Reformation on the emergence of capitalism in early modern Europe. But Weber had this incredible sort of comparative project, about why didn't China industrialize, why didn't India industrialize, about religion and culture. And so I remember thinking, like, oh my gosh, like economics is about this. Of course it isn't about that. We've been trying to make it about that, but I think that moment was very exciting for me. Then I sort of lost the plot because I decided I was going to become an economist, and then you have to learn all this mathematics and all these tech, and then all the interesting stuff kind of moves into the background, and you can't keep it in focus. I remember when I was a PhD student, I was very frustrated with all of that. Like, there were all these things that I was interested in, but they never appeared in any class. And let me say kind of two more things, about that. One of them concerning Latin America, which is, very pivotal for me. I think what kind of reconnected with many of these sort of impulses and interests was when I discovered, it wasn't on any reading list that I ever saw. I discovered in the library at Yale, Markets and States in Tropical Africa by Robert Bates, which is this fabulous book about comparative political economy in Africa. And, I think that book was very exciting, and it made me realize I didn't know anything about what I was interested in. And, how did I figure out, how to study that? Well, I think, in some sense it was going to Columbia for the first time. Well, the first time I went to, I knew all this mathematics and all this economic theory, but I sort of knew that I didn't really understand anything about what was going on in the world, or why things really happened or why they didn't really happen. And it was only going to Columbia, for the first time in 1992, where I sort of thought, oh gosh, this is a good place to study that. Like I needed to find a context. I needed to get out of this solving equations business and just like start learning about what I was interested in. And, Columbia presented itself as a fantastic place to do that. Yeah.
Mhm. That's very nice to hear that you spend so much time in our continent. Now, you mentioned that you did some readings on comparative studies, comparative political economy, which, as I understand, is why they awarded you with the Nobel Prize, in part. And so I wanted to ask a question about that, even though it's a bit cliche. Some people say it's the highest recognition you can receive as an academic. Some people might even feel it's like a culmination of a life's work. But do you see it that way, or does it make you even more ambitious about the questions you still want to answer?
Well, I mean, I think it's a big honor, obviously. There's an element of arbitrariness in it. There's many people you could give such awards to, in economics. And then, there isn't even such a prize in political science or sociology, for example. I don't know why not, or history, or, so some people get to get this and other people don't get to get it. And, so there's lots of arbitrary aspects of it, but I think it's a big thrill, and it's a kind of big thing. But actually, for me, the worst aspect of it is, people just expect you to kind of retire and talk about your great your great achievements. But I have absolutely no interest in doing that, to be honest with you. There's so many things that I don't understand, and I'm still just as excited about doing research, as I was 40 years ago. And, so I'm off to Senegal and Nigeria this summer, and I'll be in Colombia, and so I might, I think that's I've sort of got over it now, but just kind of moving ahead, uh, and but there is this element of, like, retire. Like, several people have said to me, like, "Oh, why don't you just retire?" And I'm like, "Well, why would I retire?" It's like I this is I turned my hobby into my life, so there's a weird kind of moment like that, but I think I'm over it now.
Yes. So that's a relief, I feel like, for us in Latin America, because we really appreciate the work that obviously you are doing and still and will still continue doing, right? So, with that in mind, I would like to explore one of the ideas you've been developing recently in Latin America. So, I would like to turn from your personal journey maybe to some of the ideas that have been shaping your recent work. So, Professor Robinson, one idea that particularly resonates with me as a Paraguayan student comes from your reflections on what you call the fundamental imbalance in Latin America. So, as a Paraguayan, I often feel that Paraguay occupies a unusual place in discussions about the region. The country has achieved relative macroeconomic stability, yet it continues to face many of the same development challenges as our neighbors. So perhaps I could ask you, what is the fundamental imbalance in Latin America, and where does Paraguay fit within that broader story?
Yeah, I mean, that's a kind of new work that I've been doing, with Jose Luis Falconi, who's a art historian, professor of art history and human rights at the University of Connecticut. And I think that actually, you know, that stems from a long discussion we've been having about things we don't understand in Latin America. I think when I started, studying Latin America, and trying to understand this sort of divergence within the Americas, uh, you know, my work focused very much on kind of political economy and these like deeply rooted, um, institutional differences. And I think, if you to make progress on something in social science, you have to make things kind of simple. So you have to sort of shut down other things and sort of say, I'm going to focus on the politics, I'm going to focus on institutions, I'm going to focus on, like, power relations. And that's the sort of view that we developed in scientific papers, and in, we in Why Nations Fail, for example, or the Narrow Corridor. We sort of tell this story about Latin America. But I think it's also, and in that discussion, as I said, you shut down other things like cultural differences. But I think it's also kind of clear that there are cultural differences between Latin America and North America, interesting cultural differences. Now, what are the consequences of those for economic development, the way politics works? There's arguments, there's speculation, but it hasn't been sort of researched too well. So what Jose and I have been doing is sort of trying to kind of take ideas which are very prominent in, different parts of Latin American studies or Latin American histories or Latin American culture, and think through some of their social and political and economic consequences. So, for example, the Uruguayan intellectual Angel Rama wrote this book called La Ciudad Letrada, which is sort of, and he kind of makes this point that, if you want to understand Latin America, you have to understand there's this sort of clash between what he calls the ideal and the real, and where does the ideal come from? The ideal comes from this history of kind of utopianism, which dates back to the kind of conquest, the idea that the Americas was like a kind of tabula rasa, where you could build, all of these ideal cities and schemes. And think of Brasilia, like what is Brasilia? It's a kind of utopian idea of how we make Brazil in some sense. But Rama sort of says, but the reality is always out of sync. It's out of sync with this ideal. And so that's where we'd say this fundamental disequilibrium comes from, this kind of disconnect between the real and the ideal. So what Jose and I've been doing is sort of saying, let's kind of start from that and start from, and then try to study like some of the consequences of that. I could give you one example, which is clientelism. So we talk a lot about, clientelistic politics in Latin America. And, if you read, for me, my favorite book about clientelism in Latin America would be Javier Aullero's book, Poor People's Politics, which is an ethnography of the Peronist political machine, in this barrio in Buenos Aires. And Javier, he defines clientelism as politically mediated problem solving. What do clientelistic politicians do? They solve problems, and the picture he paints is sort of like this disequilibrium. There's the ideal, the Argentinian state should provide services, it should do this, it creates opportunities. But in reality, it doesn't do that. It can't do it. It's not organized to do it. It doesn't have the capacity to do it. No one has the incentive, so there's a gap between the ideal and the real. So people think they can get these services. People think they have these rights. And what do the Peronist politicians do? They insert themselves in between the real and the ideal. So that's kind of one example of, well, if you think of that as a kind of model of like Latin America, then many things can be explained by that disequilibrium, including clientelism. So that's an attempt. But really, as I said, just to give you one example, from Colombia, one thing that I notice, in Colombia, is that like things don't go well, policy doesn't get implemented, things don't happen, but it's not because anyone necessarily has any kind of interest in that. It's like if you think about the world of Why Nations Fail, it's about kind of power relations, and that doesn't happen because, somebody has an interest in something else happen and the road doesn't get built, but, of course that goes on. But it's not the only thing that goes on. There's also this dysfunctionality, I think, and that's what we're trying to kind of capture with this idea, this sort of dysfunctionality in Latin America.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. We have a bunch of follow-up questions, I think, for all of that. But first, I'd like to pick up on something you said. You said the word utopia, and in previous work, you've definitely referred to this sense of utopianism within Latin America, both historically and until now. Do you think that utopianist thinking is always bad? Could it lead to some? Could it become possibly useful?
Yeah, not at all. Yeah, that's a great point. I don't think so. So I think when Jose and I started, I guess we were trying to explain clientelism or whatever it is. But I agree with you. In some sense, what we decided is that, this is almost a kind of Latin American model of creativity here. So think, what's the best example? Magical realism. Think about like art or in the cultural sphere. Magical realism. What is magical realism? Magical realism is, the ideal, the real, and the magical and the real. Like, how can you have the magical and the real? Think of the magical as utopian. And so what I didn't say is, okay, there's the ideal and the real. So how do those things adjust to each other? You might think, okay, there'll be some sort of feedback loop. There'll be some pragmatic, okay, people will reduce their utopian aspirations and no, but Latin Americans, this is the argument. Latin Americans don't do that. Like you have the real and the ideal, there's a disequilibrium, So the ideal, you can't really implement it. So what happens? Well, you just come with a kind of new ideal plan, and that doesn't work. So you come with a new ideal plan. Think of like endlessly trying to rewrite the Constitution. And one idea we have, and we've developed, is this idea that you sort of adapt to this disequilibrium by like adding things or kind of layering things or like combining things. A great image of this would be, religious syncretism. If you think about, the shrine of Our Lady of Guadalupe, in Mexico City. What is that? It's a Catholic church, stuck on top of a Mexica temple, a temple of a Mexica deity, sort of on top of each other. So you kind of put one thing like literally on top of another. And I think one idea we have is sort of the way you adjust to this disequilibrium is kind of you just kind of add everything or you combine everything. So the image that's used in kind of Latin American cultural studies to talk about this is the Baroque. Like Latin America is very Baroque. This idea that you can sort of combine everything. But that turns out to be a model of creativity. Think about ceviche. What is ceviche? Ceviche is like adding things, adding things that don't sound like they should go together, Japanese, Andean food, like Italian or whatever. But then you get an emergent phenomenon, So that adding is sort of a model of creativity. Maybe the best example of that we sort of been discussing recently is in international relations. If you think about like world legal order, a lot of the world legal order actually comes from Latin America. It comes from Latin Americans in the 1820s. Bolivar kind of convened this conference in Panama in 1826, actually 200 years ago, which established some of the fundamental principles of international law, and I think that model of like adding is also a kind of model of dealing with other countries, of adding international relations and kind of a model of toleration of good things and toleration of bad things. Like I remember when George W. Bush, was trying to build this coalition to invade Iraq, the Latin Americans were not interested in that. And the defense minister of Brazil famously told him, Brazil has no enemies. We have no enemies. So we would say that's coming from the same place. So there's a great example of, we can add, you can combine, it's a way of tolerating and living, cohabiting, and that's a good thing. You could say sometimes you have to tolerate bad things, but I think there's a lot of interesting kind of implications of this way of thinking that we're still kind of trying to understand. Yes, so I think you made a great point. It's not all bad.
That's super insightful. So if we talk about theory meets reality, so what I noticed, like especially in some countries in Latin America, maybe many countries today know what reforms they need already. So why is implementation so much harder than diagnosis?
Well, I think the perspective that we have here is that a lot of implementation is driven by this kind of ideal. Sometimes this, like we write laws. Latin Americans are very good at writing laws, but they're not so good at implementing them. And so I think I think from a public policy perspective, you could sort of say one thing. I would emphasize is that this is actually, this is not necessarily about interests or power relations, So that's good news, because interests and power relations are very intractable and difficult to do anything about typically. But this is more like trying to come to some understanding of this disequilibrium and how we cope with it. And I think I don't have a definitive answer to how we cope with it or how you cope with it, but one thing that we've been talking about, for example, is just maybe if you think about the discussion of the informal sector, think about the discussion of the informal sector. So from our perspective, like the formal sector in the informal sector, that's like the ideal and the real, so that's like magical realism, the informal sector, the formal sector. So what's the approach of the World Bank to thinking about the informal sector? We have to formalize it. We have to kind of force it to formalize. We have to extend the scope of regulation and the state, and we have to eliminate the informal sector. But this perspective sort of says, let me take Latin American culture as given. Like, we're not going to do anything about that. So the informal sector is a sort of natural part of this equilibrium. So maybe the informal sector can flourish in its own way, which actually is kind of what De Soto said. If you read El Otro Sendero, De Soto sort of has this image of, the informal sector as this kind of creative thing. It's doing all these things on its own. There's all this capacity. And so I think that's more what we would like to develop, this idea that maybe you just should stop trying to make the informal sector formal, and you should understand how it works in its own terms with its own kind of logic. And maybe there's a model of development, or there's a model of informal capitalism, and that can flourish and be successful. I think that's the way we'd like to think about it.
Yeah, that's really, really interesting.
This is all very refreshing to hear. I don't think there is that much research focused on Latin American countries, so this is really, really great. I'd like to ask a question about my country, which is Bolivia. I don't know if you've been keeping up with Bolivian latest news, but I know that in some of your previous work, you highlighted Bolivia as an example of how social organizations and grassroots movements can reshape institutions and challenge exclusion.
Yeah.
Today, however, some of these same social organizations are using a bit of their mobilizing power to block roads or to resist some macroeconomic reforms that I think are necessary to address the country's economic crisis. For example, the removal of fuel subsidies. Do you see Bolivia as experiencing a clash between the real and the ideal that you were mentioning, like the clash between the economic reality and these impossible political expectations?
Well, I think I find the situation in Bolivia very sad, in the sense that, wasn't it Sanchez de Lozada who was overthrown because of rioting and because of reduction of fuel subsidies, whenever? When was that? 30 years ago or something? I mean, because and I actually I never written this up, but we did some research on Bolivia, and particularly on the rise of the cocaleros and the MAS. And I do think that was a profound moment it seemed to be a profound moment of change in Bolivia. But unfortunately, what we learned from that is a kind of profound lesson from human history, which is power tends to corrupt and absolute power corrupts absolutely, meaning, there was all sorts of progress in terms of, empowerment and inclusion and promoting indigenous peoples' rights and sense of themselves. And, I think that's a fabulous thing. But then Evo Morales basically corrupted the movement, as far as I could tell. It turned into this personal project, and, at least the Bolivians managed to get rid of him, but it managed to destroy the movement in many ways, the coherence of the MAS. And so I think many things have gone into reverse. I have to say, it reminds me of what happened in Bolivia in the 1950s and 1960s. I don't know if you know this book by Jonathan Kelly and Herb Klein, called A Revolution and the Rebirth of Inequality in Bolivia, where they show that after the Bolivian Revolution in the 1950s, there was agrarian reform, there was all sorts of progressive reforms. There was a very dramatic fall in inequality, but by the end of the 1960s, inequality had gone right back to what it was at the time of the revolution. So all of those gains were kind of reversed. This one-party state consolidated itself, and then the military came. And so it seems to me, maybe, that it's almost as if we've kind of relived that experience yet again in Bolivia. This is what we call in Why Nations Fail the iron law of oligarchy. And I think one of the challenge for people like me is to try to understand, like, why is that? Why is it so difficult when you seem to have the coalescence of these kind of progressive movements and people wanting change, and it just gets kind of perverted in some sense. You could think of the PT in Bolivia and in Brazil, in some sense. The same thing happened with the PT when the PT got into power. It got corrupted. It got, you could even make an argument about Chavismo in its early days, was actually very progressive in lots of ways, but then it became a personal vehicle, for President Chavez and stuff. So there's something very systematic about this in Latin America. We don't have a good explanation for in social science.
So, for me, I feel like institutions could be the answer of some of the questions we have. So, how do you define institutions? Why do they matter so much for development? And why do some countries succeed in building more inclusive institutions while others remain trapped in extractive arrangements?
Yeah, I mean, we have a very broad. I tend to use a very broad definition of institutions as being just the kind of rules that people create, that societies create to structure social interactions, that create patterns of incentives and opportunities. We create rules in human societies. Humans have been so successful because we're able to cooperate, at large scale with sort of strangers. And the reason we can do that is because we create these rules, about how people should behave, and allows you to form expectations. It allows you to cooperate and understand what the consequences of that cooperation will be. But there's different sorts of institutions, and and some institutions kind of channel people's energies and in a socially desirable direction, and others don't. Of course, that's a very vague definition of institutions. There's many, many, many institutions in practice. I always like examples to illustrate this. In Why Nations Fail, we end that first chapter, which is about the kind of comparative history of the Americas, with the comparison not of two countries, or but of Bill Gates and Carlos Slim, and how Bill Gates and Carlos Slim got their money, made their money, made their fortunes. And there's two people, like very brilliant businessmen, intelligent, energetic, whatever, but their energies are challenged in very different directions. Bill Gates's energies are channeled to innovating in software, in operating systems. And Carlos Slim's energies are channeled towards getting his friends in the government to privatize a monopoly to him. So that's nothing to do with the people. It's to do with the institutions in which they're operating and how those create incentives. If you want to make money, how do you make money in the United States? And that's, for all the problems in the United States today, you still see that. Like, how are all these people making money? Innovation, AI, space rockets, electric cars, Amazon, providing services, whatever. Yeah, they could be monopolies. Okay, fine, but that's not how Carlos Slim made his money, And so I think that and that's just about how the institutions channel your energies and your talents and your, and so that, I think that example shows it shows the kind of profound impact of institutions on society. Maybe there's other differences too. Maybe there's cultural differences, which we've been talking about. So I think, how come, so a lot of our work is about those institutional differences in the world. Where do they come from? Well, people create them. People create them. They're created collectively, but they're also very deeply rooted in history. I think, like, what the evidence shows is that there's moments in history which we call kind of critical junctures, where institutions can be formed, they can reconform, they can be built, and then they seem to be very enduring. I think, like, for many of us, who'd like to be optimistic about Latin America or think about different futures for Latin America, I think the big fact of the matter is, like, if you look at the kind of pattern of comparative economic development in the Americas, or if you look at kind of measures of institutions, there's been remarkable stability, for a long time, so that's a fact, so I think that is evidence that, of course, you can change your institutions. Like, look at what's happened in South Korea, or look what happened in China, even Britain, for example. Historically, if you want to go back historically, nobody would ever have predicted in the 16th century that Britain was going to become this amazingly successful country, that the Industrial Revolution was going to happen there, was going to create this world empire. No, Britain was this ridiculous, marginal, poor, little, obscure place. All the action was in the Netherlands and Spain and whatever, so I think surprising things happen, and societies move on to these different development paths, and but at certain moments. But of course, we're very, as social scientists, we're very bad at predicting those moments. We're very bad at predicting when these forces come together that allows a society to kind of renegotiate or change its institutional equilibrium. So I could say, the construction of institutions is a kind of political process, and I think that's right, but it also seems very inertial,
Thank you. And so I want to just keep on asking about something you just said, which is you can change your institutions. I think some of the explanation behind institutions, for example, in Why Nations Fail, tend to be very historical. And here, for example, our professor of economics at the Blavatnik School is Stefan Derkon, who I know you know personally, and I think he often argues that development begins when certain influential groups decide to pursue a shared project of growth. So in that view, development would seem to stem a bit more from not only from institutions, but also from political agency. And so I wanted to ask you a bit what you were already touching upon. First, what comes first? Do countries develop because they have better historical institutions, or because political actors manage to build coalitions that make those institutions possible in the first place? What role does agency play in all of this?
No, I mean, I think agency does play a role. I think, as we were just discussing, in principle, institutions are an outcome of a kind of collective choice. So, people can choose their institutions. They can choose different institutions, and you can move on to a new equilibrium. But I think it's hard to come up with kind of generalizations about how that happens. So, in the colonial period is sort of relatively, it seems relatively, simple, because you have these colonial powers. If you think about Why Nations Fail, the story we tell is that the colonial powers came, but they faced very different types of societies, and in Latin America or the Caribbean, where you could build a society around exploiting indigenous people or importing slaves to grow sugarcane or whatever, then you tended to get extractive institutions. But in New England, where there were very few indigenous people, mostly because they died, and you couldn't grow plantation crops, then a different type of society emerged. But of course, in general, that everyone is acting on these equilibria, and so I think, and it's not even clear that, think about the Chinese transition, what is it that caused this Chinese transition? Well, the real thing that caused the Chinese transition actually is nothing, is the control of the communist state collapsed during the Cultural Revolution, over many parts of the country. And all of this reform started happening. Like, if you look at these places like Wenzhou, south of Shanghai, they'd already decollectivized agriculture, by the time Deng Xiaoping, ever thought that was a good idea. In fact, in the early part of the transition, the Chinese Communist Party were trying to stop that. They were trying to stop, it's only in the early 1980s they kind of decide, oh my gosh, look at this increase in productivity. Let's kind of go with the flow. The early industrialization in China in the 1980s was based on what? Township village enterprises, what they call red hat firms. They were collective. They were owned collectively. They were owned by townships, not by individuals. Like, why on earth would you have a kind of collective ownership of property? Any economist would tell you that had terrible incentive effects. Well, because it was socialist. it was kind of looked okay, at a time when it was illegal in China to employ more than 7 people. Engels made a calculation that if you employed 8 or more people, you were a capitalist. So you couldn't hire more than 7 people. So how did you get around that? Well, you had a collective, so there's a lot of improvisation. That's not the elites of the Communist Party doing that. They just were kind of catching up. It's Chinese people. It's the collapse of the state that allowed that model of enterprise. And, so where's the elite project there? There was no elite project. 15 years later, there was sort of, an elite project. But at that transition, that tectonic transition has nothing whatsoever to do with some elite kind of coming up with a project. Deng Xiaoping had no interest in creating a market economy like that. It's very well documented. Yeah, there are examples like in Rwanda, that Stefan knows well, where, there's an army and a party, and a very charismatic president, who decides he's going to push development in Rwanda, and he figures out how to implement it. So I think that, but I think this very heterogeneous, this picture, that's what I'm saying. The good news is that, that's the British story. The British Industrial Revolution didn't come about because of some elite. No, it didn't. It was a spontaneous thing. It was like Abraham Darby and Bolton and Watt and Richard Arkwright, and it's more like the Chinese transition than the Rwandan transition. So I think institutions can kind of reform themselves. That the way that can start can happen in many different ways, and I think that's difficult to generalize about. I think like what the research shows is that if you want this thing to really kind of be sustainable, if you want that, then you have to build these inclusive institutions. But in the Chinese case, kind of this thing happened, in the context of extractive institutions. And, you could think of lots of other examples. So you see what I mean? Like I think there's many paths, many things can get development going. I think that Stefan would agree with that. Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah, and in that point, like talking about different cultures, different countries, I would like to ask you one and last question about democracy. So many Latin American countries are democratic, but yet clientelism remains a persistent feature of our politics. So why has democracy often failed to replace clientelistic relationships with stronger public institutions, especially in Latin America?
Well, I think you can come at that from different angles. I think that, the standard story, the story that, we tell in The Narrow Corridor, for example, is that's about weak state institutions, that I mean, this is one of the, democratization. I think, I think the big picture is that Latin America has been doing better under democracy than it was doing under dictatorship.
Okay.
But you're absolutely right that democracy has been very disappointing in lots of ways, because it's clientelistic and it's corrupt. And that just shows that, democratizing in the context of weak state institutions creates all sorts of problems. It facilitates clientelism and, but another way of thinking about it would be, the ideas that we started our discussion with, which is maybe there's something cultural here. I mean, that there's something cultural about the nature of clientelism, and and that's going to persist, even if you change your political institutions. So I think there's different ways of thinking about that. I think what's happened, in Latin America, and there's been some fantastic research, by Latin American scholars on this, like Claudio Ferraz and Fred Finan, who've worked on kind of looking at the effect of institutions or of institutions of accountability on corruption and politics in Brazil in particular. So we've been trying to kind of, push the ideal onto the real, if you like that metaphor, as a solution to this problem. But, maybe there's scope for other ways of thinking about this. I think we could all agree that hasn't been terribly successful. Maybe it just takes time. Maybe you get to some tipping point and then suddenly institutions start improving. But there is something kind of very enduring about these equilibria that remains to be understood.
Thank you, Professor. Unfortunately, we're almost out of time. One last question that we always ask our guests here at the Oxford Policy Pod: is there a book or movie that you like to recommend to our audience?
Can be anything.
A book or a movie about Latin America?
Not necessarily, just something that has shaped the way you think or piqued your interest.
Yes.
Well, for Latin Americans, I really recommend this new book by Greg Grandin, who's a historian at Yale University, called America, which is a kind of new history of not of the Americas, of the relationship between Latin America and North America. I think it's really powerful and exciting, and it puts a whole new, spin on the hemisphere. So I for the Latin Americans, I think that's really good to read. And for a movie, gosh, I don't know. Like I just
No,
watched.
it was either a book or a movie.
Oh, either a
Don't
book
worry,
or a
don't
movie.
worry.
Okay.
That's perfect. So, Professor Robinson, thank you so much for joining us today. It has been a real privilege to learn from your work and to reflect on these questions about Latin America and trying to improve the conversation about what it is important to our continent.
We've learned about imbalances, clientelism, democracy, cultural differences. Really, thank you, Professor, for such a thoughtful conversation.
My pleasure. Been fun.
And thank you to our listeners for joining us for this episode of Oxford Policy Podcast. We hope you enjoyed the conversation and we look forward to seeing you again on the next episode. Thank you very much.